Good morning and welcome to the 23rd meeting in 2025 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. I remind all members and witnesses to ensure that their devices are on silent. Mark Griffin MSP and Fulton McGregor MSP are joining us online this morning. The first item on our agenda is to decide whether to take items 5 and 6 in private. Are we agreed? We're agreed. Thanks. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence on the Climate Change Local Development Plan Repeals Scotland Order 2025 draft from Ivan McKee MSP, who's the Minister for Public Finance, and Mr McKee is joined by Adam Henry, who's a Senior Planner at the Scottish Government, and I welcome our witnesses to the meeting this morning. The instrument is laid under the affirmative procedure, which means the Parliament must approve it before it comes into force. Following this evidence session, the committee will be invited at the next agenda item to consider a motion to approve that instrument. And I remind everyone that Scottish Government officials can speak under this item, but not in the debate that follows. And I now invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Committee. And thanks for the opportunity to come and speak to you today. On 27th March 2025, the Scottish Government laid in Parliament the 15th Annual Report on the operation of Section 72 of the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009 as required by the Act. Section 3F of the Town and Country Planning Act Scotland 1997 relates to greenhouse gas emissions from the use or operation of new buildings. It was introduced into the Planning Act by Section 72 of the Climate Change Act. It requires local development plans prepared by planning authorities to include policy that aims to avoid a specified and rising proportion of greenhouse gas emissions from the operation of buildings. The reduction of emissions is to be achieved by using low and zero carbon generating technologies. Ministers are required by Section 73 of the Climate Change Act to report annually on the operation, effectiveness and continued requirement for Section 3F. Where this requirement is considered no longer to be necessary, Section 73 explicitly enables repeal of Section 3F by order. The most recent annual report concluded that after 1 January 2025, the latest policy and regulatory position goes beyond what Section 3F can achieve, and that the requirement to include policies within local development plans under Section 3F is no longer necessary. The conclusion enabled the repeal order being considered today to be prepared under existing provision of the Climate Change Scotland Act 2009. Planning and heat policy related to building decarbonisation has progressed significantly since Section 3F was introduced, surpassing what Section 3F can achieve. Maintaining Section 3F places unnecessary and redundant resource burdens on planning authorities at a time when streamlining costs and processes within the planning system is vital. Repeal of the legislation acts only on the requirement for planning authorities to include the Section 3F approach in their next local development plans. Repeal of the legislation does not alter or repeal any current adopted local development plan policies that are a response to Section 3F. The principle of repeal was included in the 2017 consultation regarding the Planning Scotland Bill, now the 2019 Planning Act. At that time, there was general support for withdrawal of Section 3F. With the 2019 Act giving the National Planning Framework an enhanced status as part of the Statutory Development Plan and NPF4 now firmly established, the Section 3F requirements for local development plans are no longer required. I welcome the opportunity to answer any questions the committee may have regarding the details contained within the repeal order.
Thanks very much for that opening statement. I have a couple of questions. So, what I understand is that the benefits of the proposed repeal are likely to be for those involved in design of development, applicants for planning permission, planning authorities and Scottish ministers as procedural and implementation burdens from the parallel operations of Section 3F, National Planning Framework 4, new build heat standard and associated building regulations are resolved by the repeal of, as you've been saying, Section 3F, and focus can be on applying the latest policy and legislation in relation to greenhouse gas emissions. So in that light, if the repeal goes ahead, I'd be interested to hear, firstly, what steps would architects, designers be required to take under NPF4 and the NBHS to ensure that their new developments minimise greenhouse gas contributions?
Okay, so the new build heat standard obviously lays down the requirement for moving away from fossil fuel, using heat sources, and that already, of course, is in place. So that gives effect to that requirement. And, of course, NPF4, through the whole range of its policies, has policies on climate, which talk to the requirements for planning decisions to be made in that light and within those policies. So I think it's true to say that Section 3F of its time was useful in order to focus on the requirements to reduce carbon emissions, and to do so through the local development plans. But where we are now with the new build heat standard and NPF4 in place, those requirements are addressed through that mechanism, and there's no need to have this effectively redundant process in place that chews up resource.
Thanks. Could you give an indication of the climate policies you have in mind in NPF4?
Oh, so remind me of the numbers, Adam.
Yeah, sorry, do you want to
Yeah.
pick up on that? Yeah, it'll just be
Yeah,
policy.
if Adam can talk to the...
Come on in,
pick up
Adam.
on that if that's okay.
I can just rattle through the numbers.
Yeah. There'll be policy 2. Do you want the titles as well?
It's fine, just the numbers is
So there'll
good.
be policy 2, policy 11, policy 19, and policy 26.
Brilliant. Great. Thanks. And my second question, which might lead to the same answer, is what requirements would there be on applicants for planning permission? What requirements would there be on applicants for planning permission, consider how greenhouse gas contributions can be minimised? Hope you got that.
Yeah, so it's the same. Obviously, they would understand that the decision would be made in the context of NPF4 policies, as we've outlined, and obviously the requirements for the new build heat standards, or anything they bring forward. If they're expecting it to be passed, they would need to comply with those policies and that standard.
Great. So anyone who's wanting to develop anything needs to be looking at those four.
Yeah.
NPF4 policies and the new build heat standard, and then they should be okay, and they should be helping us move towards carbon emission reduction.
Well, I mean, okay, in the sense of they would be complying with those policies were they to do so, but clearly there are other things in the planning system they would also have to comply
Yes,
with.
absolutely, yeah. Great, okay. Thanks very much for that. Does anyone else have any questions? Nope, okay. So that concludes questions from members, and I'm now going to turn to agenda item 3, which is the formal consideration of motion S6M 18057, calling for the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee to recommend approval of the Climate Change Local Development Plan Repeals Scotland Order 2025 draft. And I invite the Minister to speak and move this motion.
Move to convener.
Thank you. I now invite contributions from members. We're content. Would you like to sum up?
No need, thank you.
Okay. And the question is that motion S6M 18057 in the name of Ivan McKee be approved. Are we all agreed? We're all agreed, thank you. And the committee will report on the outcome of this instrument in due course, and I invite the committee to delegate responsibility to me as convener to approve a draft of the report for publication. Thank you. Thank you, Minister, and thank you, Adam. And we will suspend briefly to allow you to depart and welcome our next panel of witnesses. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence as part of our scrutiny of the Scottish Budget 2026 to 27. And we're joined by Andrew Burns, who's the Deputy Chair of the Accounts Commission, Derek Ewell, who's a Commission member, Blythe Deans, who's the Audit Director at Audit Scotland, and Martin McLaughlin, who is a Senior Manager at Audit Scotland. And I welcome our witnesses to the meeting. We've got around 90 minutes for this discussion. There's no need for you to operate your own microphones, and members will direct, well, I think we've agreed we're going to direct our questions to Andrew in the first instance, and then you can distribute them as you think appropriate. So I'm going to start the questions. And the first one is around the Commission's kind of call for transformational change, and that you've indicated that there's not enough evidence of truly transformational change taking place. But last week we heard from one council chief executive that they had a sense that the word transformation was too loose. And what does it actually mean? So I'd be interested to hear from yourselves, what does a transformed local authority look like? What should local authorities look like in 10 years' time?
Okay, thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, Convener and colleagues. And thanks for the invite to the committee this morning to give evidence, and now hopefully to expand and talk to that evidence. The Commission and Audit Scotland very much welcome the invitation. I'm joined by Derek Ewell, who's a member of the Commission as well, and two Audit Scotland colleagues, Blythe and Martin, as you've indicated. And we're looking forward to expanding on the queries you put before us. I should just start, Convener, by repeating the apology from Jo Armstrong, who's the Chair of the Accounts Commission. Unfortunately, or not for her, this committee session has clashed with her annual leave and she's on holiday, so you're stuck with me and Derek instead. I mean, I know you've got the written submission from us, and I'll maybe just read out one quote as a sort of starting gambit, and then I'll address your point about transformation directly. But in the covering letter that Jo put to the Commission when she submitted the evidence, on the top page, it does indicate that councils generally have been very effective in identifying and delivering efficiency savings at the same time as largely maintaining how services are performing. Relying on these savings alone, however, Jo said in our covering letter, is not sufficient to meet the scale of financial challenge and maintain the levels and quality of vital services that councils provide in the face of increasing demands on those services. And that, Convener, leads me directly to the issue you've just raised, because what the Commission has been requesting and cajoling about for many, many months, if not years now, is the fact that resources, well, we could have a long debate, and many of us around the table have done this already in different environments, about the quantum of money that's available to local government. But I think everybody can accept, surely, without getting stuck on percentage points, that it's relatively static, and over the period of the last 10 to 15 years, it's been a really challenging financial envelope for local authorities to cope with. Has slightly improved in the last couple of years. The Commission recognises that. But overall, it's been a very, very challenging time. And just continuing to do what's always been done with diminishing or static resources, with increasing demand, is no longer sufficient to keep those services at the level that individuals, public members like all of us around the table would want to see. And therefore, that's why the Commission has been asking for transformation. And just to come directly to your point, the Commission did publish a report last year, and I may turn to Blythe and other colleagues in the second, Convener, to sort of expand on this, about transformation. And we looked in that report, we identified 5 principles for local authorities to aspire to and to deliver. And without going into the detail of all, it was vision, planning, governance, collaboration and innovation. Now, those are obviously nice words, but they do have within that report, underneath each of those 5 titles, quite a bit of detail about what each local authority should be aspiring or attempting to do in those areas. And I think it's really important to say that we have got examples of transformation happening in several local authorities across Scotland now, and indeed we've embedded transformation as the thematic into our best value reports for this ongoing year. I think I'm right in saying, Blythe will correct me in a second if I'm wrong, we're about 10 out of 32 of the local authorities have now reported, so we've got, based on the thematic of transformation. So we are building up quite a bit of evidence now about what is working well transformatively and what's not working well. So we've got 10 out of 32 by the end of the next cycle, you know, in 8-9 months, we'll have all 32. So next year, I think we'll be able to publish an update on the transformation report that I've just referenced that has those 5 principles. And I would hope that will be of significant interest. I think it's going to come probably to the next government or the next parliament, but it will be a significant interest when it does publish. So those 5 principles are really what the Commission has been looking for and what we mean by transformation. A clear vision, clear planning, robust governance, collaboration, not just in and with other local authorities, but across the local government family, so police, fire, etc., and innovation. I'm happy to stop there, Convener. Hope that opens it up and pass to Blythe, who might want to expand on some of that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew. So I think first and foremost, in terms of how we approach this work, there was a recognition that one size does not fit all for councils, and any sort of transformative activity needs to meet the local context and the needs of the communities and citizens. So as part of that, we've tried to frame our responses through the Transformation in Councils report in a way that's appropriate to those demands. As Andrew mentioned, there's also been a focus on transformation as the current best value area of thematic focus, and through that we've gathered some examples. We specifically requested examples from councils as to what they saw as the transformational activity that's been undertaken, so that we can then gather that in a way that presents a national picture to establish a bit of a benchmark in terms of progress, but also to promote learning and gain a bit of traction to that across the country. So, as Andrew mentioned, 10 of those reports have been through committee at the kind of time of speaking, and while that doesn't necessarily represent a perfectly representative sample of Scotland, it does give us a bit of a basis and a feeling as to what's likely to come through as we start to gather more of those reports. So, without going into too much detail of the examples that we have so far, I can give the committee an example just around the sort of main headings that they would probably most naturally fit under. The first of which is service redesign or rationalisation. There may be an argument to say that reduction also comes into that category. There's digitalisation of services or council contact, so the way that communities and citizens actually engage with the council, as you might expect, a lot of online tools in support of that. And the final one is collaboration with partners to improve outcomes. So again, it's been really welcome that the Commission have received examples in all of these areas, and there's a bit of work for us to do as a team to, I guess, moderate some of that and come up with a national report that presents that in a way that's helpful for the sector.
Okay. Great. Thanks very much. So following on from that question, and I'll come back to you, Andrew, the Commission has listed 11 barriers to transformation and acknowledges that some of these are external, so not within the Council's control, whilst others are internal. And I'd be interested to understand from your sense what are the most significant external barriers to these transformations, and how could the forthcoming Scottish budget help address these?
Okay, thanks, Convener. I mean, I think that obviously clearly falls with that general query you've put to me falls within, I think, the 4th principle I mentioned, which was collaboration. So I guess I think what you're getting at, and I'll come on to what I think are the most significant barriers, but is that local authorities can't solve these challenges by themselves. And I briefly alluded to this in my opening comments around collaboration, not just with other local authority partners. And we've got some good examples. The 3 Ayrshire councils, I would particularly point out, are doing good work around bringing some of their actual service delivery together across 3 local authority areas, which is really pretty impressive in the current climate, because there's not a huge amount of that happening in terms of pure service delivery. So there are really good examples of collaboration across local authorities. And then there are other examples of good collaboration, a lot of it driven partly by city-region deals across the wider local government family, so not just within the 32 local authorities, but with the partners as well. I touched on some, police, fire, universities, colleges, many others. And so there are positives around that collaboration. And I think what the Commission is really arguing in much of its feedback now to local authorities and when we come before Parliament is that that collaboration is going to be absolutely essential now, that local authorities are not going to be able to deliver the quality of services that we all want to see with the resources they've got against the demand that's ever increasing. It's just not a circle that can be squared or a square that can be circled. And just to come to your point about the key sort of blockages, I mean, undoubtedly, linked to finance, I mean, without dwelling on the quantum of finance, it's the fact that local authorities are still, as we sit here today, only receiving a one-year budget. Now, I know there's an aspiration in the Verity House Agreement, and hopefully through the UK upcoming budget and the subsequent Scottish budget, that may change. I think we would contest, as the Commission, based on the evidence that we've seen, that a move to a 3-year budget programme for local authorities without getting stuck into the debate about why it's not happened to date, would make a really significant change. It would unblock a significant barrier and allow local authorities to have a bit more of a medium-term planning highline that would just give them a bit more scope to make decisions around the 5 principles that I just outlined. So I think if I was to pick on one of the most significant barriers, Convener, it would be that. It would be the level of annualised budget. If that could be extended to 3 years, it would make a very, very significant difference. I mean, there are others that we could discuss further if you like. I mean, around ring fencing, that has already been greatly improved in terms of ring fencing being reduced by the Verity House Agreement as it develops. But the annualised budgets hasn't yet changed, although, as I say, I think there is an aspiration and potentially a likelihood that could be about to happen.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's helpful. I mean, I think that is completely relevant to the topic of the Scottish Government budget, the call for multi-year funding. And I could imagine that if more people understood that our Scottish Government and our local authorities, our councils work to one-year budgets, they'd be pretty shocked and actually pretty amazed at what gets delivered on the back of that. So it is welcome news coming from the UK Government. Let's see what happens. Yeah. I'm now going to move on. And I think some of the other things that you're talking, some of the other barriers might come out in the rest of the conversation this morning. I'm going to bring in Evelyn Tweed.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, gentlemen. Don't normally have an all-male panel. It's quite unusual. Andrew, you had talked about collaboration, local authorities, who they're supposed to be working with to perform well. What changes have resulted from integrated joint services and community planning partnerships? And are we still seeing the same level of siloed budgeting?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question, Evelyn. And we did notice that we are all male. I'm actually before the Public Audit Committee tomorrow, and it'll be 50-50 tomorrow. Anyway, that's by the by. Thanks for your question. I mean, it's an important point. I'll bring in probably Blythe and Martin to sort of back some of this up. But there's no doubt that is an issue, that the collaboration for local authorities, as I've just sort of expanded on in response to the convener's earlier points. We have got good examples around the community planning partnerships where it's working well. I think the direct answer to your point about how is it going is the progress is varied. It is good in some local authority areas and not so good in other local authority areas. The collaboration both within and across local authorities and within and across external partners. Some community planning partnerships, it tends to be, although this isn't universally correct, but it tends to be the larger local authorities that have more significant capacity to put revenue and resource into the development of partnerships, where they have potentially a more effective network across a region. There are small local authorities where that's effective as well, but generally it tends to be the larger ones. And it's a general truth, actually, that small, I'm sure you picked this up from your evidence of chief executives just last week, I think it was, convener, that the small local authorities do have challenges that larger ones don't have across a whole gamut of areas, and this is one of them. So there is good practice happening in terms of the collaboration within the community planning partnerships, and I mentioned the Ayrshires and across local authorities. So we have got evidence, and in the transformation report, which is available on the Commission's website, and which is alluded to in the evidence which our chair submitted to the convener, which I know you've got in advance of today's meeting, there are clear examples of where collaboration has been effective and where it has resulted in budget savings and service improvements, but it's not universal across the whole of Scotland. And I guess that linking it to the blockages point that the convener asked me about, a longer term planning frame would help. Ongoing releasing of ring fencing, which is happening and the Commission welcomes, would continue to help. And just more significant direction from Scottish Government would also, it is happening with the bidding fund at the moment is good, but it would be much more effective if that was, again, set across a longer 3-year timeline instead of a 1-year timeline. I don't know if Blythe wants to add anything to that point. Thanks, Evelyn.
Thanks, Andrew. So it might be helpful for me also just to touch on shared services as part of that collaboration and evidence of that. So through our programme of best value reports, we will assess the extent to which shared services have been used in a local area. And I guess, much like I kind of offered as part of the initial response to the question on transformation, shine a spotlight on that and promote that across the country so that the good aspects of that can then be built upon by other local authority areas. So just to give a bit of a flavour as to what that looks like, and as Andrew said, it is mixed, I would say, and consistent in terms of scale. And I guess it's difficult for us to be able to offer a consistent view on effectiveness because they are quite small scale and isolated examples. There are some examples that might be helpful for the committee to be aware of, including the sharing of internal audit services across local authority areas. There's also examples across the wider internal audit function being shared across multiple local authorities, revenues and benefits services, some services within education and children's services, as well as waste management. And we've also got the example within roads, Tayside contracts, for example. So there's quite a lot going on, but again, it's maybe just that kind of lack of coordination and bringing all that together that might be more helpful for councils to have to refer to when it comes to the wider transformation activity that takes place. There's also maybe a point about the sector-led transformation that's ongoing at the moment, led by the Society of Local Authority Chief Executives and the Improvement Service, and digital shared services is one of the key pillars of that. So again, if there's a bit of traction and a bit of momentum with sharing of services, that can only be a good thing. But it's also important to note that that can't be the only answer. It needs to be just one part of the overall approach.
So you feel when that you do this work that this will be, if there's examples of good practice, it can possibly help local authorities that are maybe struggling with some of these issues to bring themselves up?
Absolutely, yeah. So one of the aspects of that wider approach to transformation is the Peer Collaborative Improvement Project that's been led by the Improvement Service, supported by Solace as well. That's an area that almost does exactly what you've suggested there around identifying where that strong practice is, to shine that light upon it and then engage and encourage other councils to learn from and to take on board in developing their own approach to that. And I think I speak on behalf of Audit Scotland and the Accounts Commission and say we're really supportive of that work. Within the response to the pre-budget scrutiny letter, we made reference to the potential for our best value work to form a basis for some of that peer collaborative improvement work as well. So it feels like there's a bit of momentum building with that. And as I say, really happy to support that.
That's me, convener.
I'm now going to bring in Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, convener. Good morning, everybody. I wonder if I could just ask about the community dimension to transform local government services. Andrew, you mentioned the 5 themes: vision, planning, governance, collaboration, innovation. How far do they reach out into communities to get their participation in the whole agenda about transforming local government services?
Yeah, another good point, Willie. Thanks for asking it. And I mean, it underlies communication with communities, underlies almost all of those. Obviously, particularly the collaboration and the innovation areas, but it does underlie them all. And the transformation report, which we've referenced several times already in the opening discussion, does again illustrate some very, very good examples of where transformation has been effective and has taken local communities along the journey, and they've been involved and they've felt local communities have felt as if they've had things done with them and not to them. And it sounds a little glib, but it is such a crucial difference. I mean, local communities, when they feel are having things done to them, tend to resist and challenge, quite rightly so. And all the evidence that the Commission and Audit Scotland see across our best value work and our performance audit work illustrates that time after time. You know, many, without quoting any direct examples at the moment, many of the challenges that we see local authorities struggling with in terms of rationalising budgets often hinges around a lack of early enough and deep enough local community engagement. So I think the evidence that we've got from, and particularly from the 10 that we've got back already that Bly's alluded to, does illustrate that early and deep community consultation actually helps with effective transformation, and that trying to transform without that can be done, but it won't be as effective as trying to take communities with you so that they feel like they're having things done with them and not to them. I hope that addresses partly the point you wanted to raise. Well, I can see that Derek wants to come in as well.
Yes, thanks, Andrew. It was just really to add to that, probably maybe more on a negative side, but to stress the points Andrew's making. I think we have seen evidence in recent years of councils going back on budget proposals, and that illustrates where there maybe hasn't been the degree of community engagement that there needed to be at an earlier stage, if you'd even people taking legal action against councils. So that's obviously something that we've been concerned about. So I think the points Andrew's making are very pertinent for this discussion. I mean, I can certainly recall one recent best value audit visit we did with a council. They were highlighting one of the real barriers they were facing to change was sort of localised groups who were mounting probably in a sort of minority sense, but were mounting quite a vociferous campaign against proposals. So again, they highlighted that as a challenge they were facing. So I think it illustrates the point Andrew's making, that community engagement at an early stage is critical to get some radical change going forward.
Yeah, good. Have we seen enough of it, do you think, and across the board? For example, this committee has seen some great work in North Ayrshire on community wealth building, where the words that you used there, Andrew, that kind of early participation with communities, it's really paying dividends. And in Fife as well, as I understand, so there's some really great stuff going on that I think is transformative. But are you seeing enough of that, do you think, across the board to push this agenda on a bit faster and a bit quicker, do you think?
I mean, I think the honest answer to that question has got to be, well, I'm afraid, no. I mean, if you look at, I mean, the North Ayrshire one you've just referenced is one that we've seen as well and is very effective and commendable. And there's many others which are also equally as effective and commendable. But they don't make up a majority of the 32 local authorities by a long chalk, I'm afraid to say. And that's not, you know, we understand as Commission members, as Audit Scotland officers, that it's difficult. It's really difficult at a local authority level to take your community along with you and to involve them at an early enough stage. It's really hard. So, you know, I don't want my comments or our sort of evidence to come across as if we're frustrated that local authorities just not getting on with it. We completely understand it's hard. But if you look at any set of findings for any of our best value reports, any of the conclusions or recommendations from a performance audit work, whether directly from the Commission or from the Auditor General, you'll see pretty much universally a call for earlier engagement with local communities. And just that consistency of that message says to us that it's not happening enough across the breadth of local government in Scotland.
Is there a wee bit of a job of work to be done, though, in illustrating to some authorities what transformation actually looks like, what it means? Is there an issue there? Is that one of the barriers? What does this actually mean and what does it look like? Yeah.
I mean, I think, yes, that's a fair enough point. And colleagues may want to come in on this as well. But the answer is yes, there is, and that is partly, I think, picked up in some of the debate that Evelyn's question prompted as well, that, you know, good examples are out there. And Blythe mentioned the work that Solace and the Improvement Service, Society of Local Authority Chief Executives in Scotland, and Improvement Service IS are doing. In fact, Commission September meeting happened just last week, and we had Solace officers in a private session before us. So I'm just trying to underscore that point that Blythe made, that we do work as closely as we possibly can as the Commission, as Audit Scotland, with Solace and the Improvement Service to try and do just exactly what you're alluding to, Willie, to try and raise awareness of good practice. I know I've mentioned it a few times now, but when we do come to publish our, it'll be more than 1 year on, but sort of 1 year on transformation update report, I think that will have a lot of very concrete evidence of what's gone well, as well as some evidence about things that haven't gone so well. Blythe.
Yeah, just to further build on that, Mr Coffey, what might also be helpful for the committee to be aware of is within the Transformation and Councils report, we set out some principles of transformation to provide a bit of a reference point for councils in assessing where they're at against that kind of picture of what it might look like for a transformed council. And what's really encouraging is to hear that councils are using that on a self-assessment basis to take that chance to take a step back and reflect on where they are against those principles. So, as Andrew says, that will hopefully build into any follow-up work we do in that area. And the national report on the 32 local transformation reports will also build on that particular story. So I think there's some encouragement there in terms of what councils are doing proactively to assess themselves against those principles.
Okay, great. My other question is an interesting one. I think it came from the Chief Executive Clackmannan last week, Nicky Rydell, who, and I better use her words, she said at the same time as councils are transforming and reforming, auditors also need to be in the same space. Some of the traditional skill sets of auditors might not be as relevant in terms of evaluating new and complex models. So I had to use the exact words, if you don't mind. So I would be interested in your response and your reaction to that kind of comment.
Thanks, Will. You'll be surprised to hear that I did listen to Nicky's evidence. So I was sort of expecting that question. I recognise and acknowledge the point that the Chief Executives made last week. But I mean, I would say, wouldn't I, that the vast majority of relationships between local authorities and auditor teams, whether it's internal to Audit Scotland or external to private firms, because remember we've got the mixed model in Scotland, which does have strengths as well as challenges, but primarily strengths, I think the Commission would contest. The vast majority of those relationships are constructive, are positive. There's always going to be times when the point that I think Nicky was raising does flare up, when there's an issue around a particular challenge inside a local authority and tensions rise. I mean, there's no point in denying any of that, but I think it really is important to stress that the vast majority of all the relationships we see across all 32 authorities between auditors, whether private or internal to Audit Scotland, and local authorities is extremely positive. And in actual fact, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and claim that local authorities welcome being audited by Audit Scotland every year, but they certainly welcome the output in the main, because even when it's a slightly negative potential output, I think just linking it maybe to the point that Blythe just mentioned about your councils are already picking up on the 5 principles of the transformation report that we published. And they do pick up and respond to and use the findings that the Commission makes and the recommendations that come from Audit Scotland. So, I note the point that the Chief Execs made last week, but I think I really would like just to stress that, as I've said a couple of times, that the vast majority of relationships across all 32 authorities between auditors and local authorities themselves are extremely positive.
But the councils themselves, do they always agree with your recommendations then?
Derek might want to come in on that. Thanks.
I was going to come in before you asked that supplementary question there. So you caught me on the hop. No would be the short answer to that. I mean, that's quite understandable. They won't always agree with every recommendation. So I would say the vast majority, and there would be an engagement before a report is issued, and we'd usually capture the authority's response as part of that. The point I was going to make, and I said, audit of local government is probably different from the private sector, and auditors have a slightly wider remit than you would expect in the private sector. There's a much greater focus on the actual accounts. I think that the work that's done round about best value would be one example where that remit is wider. And the point I would make is, particularly if there's concern that auditors are perhaps not up to speed, I would implore councils to engage with their auditors at an early stage. If they are doing something radical, they should engage at an early stage, and the auditors should be prepared to help them through that process and perhaps highlight areas that they might be concerned with and ask them, had they thought about something. So it's important they get the balance of risk right, and it's not always easy at the start to know what might transpire when you're going through a project. So I would suggest that councils should engage at an early stage. If they're doing something different or radical, transformative, then they should engage with their auditors at an early stage, just so the auditors are aware of what's happening, so you could avoid that perhaps criticism that might come at a later stage. But there are quality assessments that are undertaken, I think 3 times a year, that Audit Scotland's Quality Assessment Unit will engage with all the audit firms and the auditors across the country. So there's an assessment, a performance assessment made of how the auditors themselves are performing. And as I said, we do engage with councils directly and indirectly, and they're asked at the end of each year, how they have viewed the audit. So if there are any issues or concerns about the audit, there's a forum by which these can be raised. I don't know, is there anything else, Blythe?
I feel like this might be my right of reply as an auditor here. But no, I mean, I think just building on what Andrew and Derek have said, I think as auditors, certainly within Audit Scotland and our performance audit and best value team that Martin and I head up, we provide detailed guidance ahead of each of the best value thematic rounds of work. So that will bring a degree of consistency in terms of the materials, the structure, the methodology that auditors use. So that consistency should be helpful in terms of the experience that the councils have in terms of engaging with their auditors. We also have a local government sector forum meeting, which brings all of the auditors of local authorities together 3 times a year to discuss the emerging issues and challenges. And again, much like Derek has said, at that meeting, if there have been any kind of isolated incidents at specific councils, we can discuss that as a group and work on a resolution if required, or come up with an approach that works best for all involved. So that, alongside the detailed consultation and engagement that takes place with councils themselves. So recently the Commission consulted on its work programme. That involved discussions with Solace, with Directors of Finance. And again, there's opportunities within that to feed some of that back to us. And then we can act on that going forward to make sure, as I say, it's the most appropriate arrangement for delivery.
Great. I have time for one more on that. Internal audit. All councils will have an internal audit function right across the council, and for many years when I was on the audit committee, we focused in on the duties and roles of internal audit compared to, let's say, external audit. Should the internal audit function in any council effectively come up with the same kind of ideas and proposals that you yourself are tabling through the Accounts Commission reports, Andrew? Why should we need a double layer to effectively say the same thing?
Right. I mean, I may well bring officer colleagues in to sort of help me with this, but I mean, I think in general, I mean, if you think about, this is tempting fate, isn't it? If you think about what's happened to some of the local authorities in England recently, I mean, Birmingham, Nottingham, now there's a whole set of reasons why, around those specific 2 that I've just mentioned, why things went wrong, but they went badly wrong, and the councils basically had to have, imposition of external management and external audit. And I don't doubt for a second there is a lot of truth in the argument that the removal of the equivalent of the Accounts Commission in England a long time ago, the current UK government is now consulting on a sort of potential return of something similar to what used to exist and now exists in Scotland, has been. But part of that, the story around the failure in some of the local authorities in England, has been about the lack of audit, I guess is the point I'm trying to make, the lack of external, if not necessarily internal. And I guess that just, for us, underscores the importance of audit, that yes, we do need it. Because today, and like I said, I don't want to be tempting fate here, but today, whilst there's undeniably difficult pressures and unbelievably difficult decisions being faced by all 32 local authorities across Scotland, none of them have got into a situation similar to what happened to any of them to some of the ones down south. And I'm not going to, we're not going to sit here and claim that that's just because of auditors. But the audit framework in Scotland has definitely, we would contest, played a part in keeping everybody on the sort of financial straight and narrow. So it does need that external and internal check. I think we would contest yes. Derek.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other point I would make is that internal and external audit should and do work very closely together, and they will try and avoid duplication. I think from my previous experience, internal audit by its very nature tends to be more internal, looking at kind of core systems, and I know external audit will rely on that work as part of their assurance. So there shouldn't be a duplication as such. Blythe probably will know this better than I do, but there should be a good working relationship between internal and external audits to ensure that they're not duplicating work. They will place reliance on the work that's been done by one and the other.
Okay. Blythe? All right. Thanks for those answers. Thank you very much.
But I think it was a very important question, Willie. I think thanks for asking that and just getting that clarity that there isn't a duplication. But I also think that the auditing piece, so I think, Andrew, at the top of that, you said that local authorities don't look forward or don't welcome being audited. But I do think being audited is part of the relationship. It's like two sides of the walnut in a way, right? It's essential feedback loops for councils to keep them in that, as you said, straight and narrow. So I think that relationship is really important. I wanted to come back before I'm going to go into a question on Invest to Save Fund, but before I do, I just want to come back to the question that Willie brought up around councils working with communities. And the Minister of Public Finance, he made a statement to Parliament on the public service reform strategy, and during that statement he was talking about a whole range of things, simplifying a whole lot of things, and he said that we're going to unlock the potential of the third sector. And I think one of the things that sits with me, and you talked about the challenge of communities feeling things being done to them and the importance of councils being more collaborative and engaging, going beyond consultation in a way. But this unlocking potential of the third sector concerns me in that we're then looking at the third sector, which is mostly volunteer-run boards, picking up quite a lot of things that public services, local authorities can no longer handle. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that. Are we kind of, should we be concerned that we're kind of pushing things into the third sector, and maybe that's not a space that's not got this feedback loop?
Okay, no, it's a very valid point, Convener. I'm not sure if you're aware, but in a previous role, I'm no longer, but I was convener of the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations for 6 years, so it's an issue I'm sort of familiar with it, and we do see it across our audit work as the Accounts Commission and Audit Scotland as well, and the Auditor General. I'm sure we'll see it a lot. Yeah, I haven't read in detail the piece of evidence you just referenced from the Minister, but I would imagine that the issue we were discussing earlier on about moving to multi-year funding, 3-year budgets, that might have been a bit of what was behind it in his mind, because if we do see a multi-year budget from the UK government, which potentially, and this is all obviously slight speculation, but if later this year into early next year it does lead to multi-year funding for local authorities, I'm sure the committee is aware that there's been a lot of pressure from the voluntary sector in Scotland for multi-year funding from local authorities inside Scotland. And one would hope, and based on what we've seen, that if that multi-year funding does flow through, it should go all the way through to voluntary sector organisations, and that would help them in the same way that the argument I just made about multi-year funding helping local authorities plan better. It would help the voluntary sector plan better, and therefore would enable them to, I guess, maybe what the Minister was referring to is, to help with community engagement and therefore improve the sort of quality of collaboration. But I absolutely take the sort of note of caution behind your question that there's a balance to be careful about here, that there isn't a sort of dependency on the voluntary sector as opposed to local authorities delivering services directly. But the current climate we're all working within, there's no doubt that the voluntary sector has been depended on more and more and more. And I guess the point I'm just trying to drive home is that I think a multi-year funding settlement that flowed right through to them would be of enormous benefit and would help ease some of the sort of concern I think you've validly got about too much being put on them within sort of next year's framework.
Okay, that's helpful. I'll just add I think, yes, multi-year funding will be good, but we're still looking at a lot of, certainly, and I can imagine colleagues meet the same when they go out to meet Development Trust or whichever organisations that are doing all this great work, that there is volunteer run. And I find it's a kind of a smaller pool of people who want to be on boards and want to start taking the levels of responsibility and compliance and all of that kind of thing. But I know that's not your job, but I think that it's good just to recognise that that's, I think when we talk about the delivery of services from local government, from councils, that we also need to recognise that things are moving to the third sector as well. I'm going to move on, and I'm going to ask a question around the Invest to Save Fund. So I'd be interested to hear your views on the Invest to Save Fund and how could future iterations of the fund support more collaboration and flexibility, which is one of your 5 pillars that you're seeking to see happen.
Yeah. I mean, I may well bring colleagues in to sort of speak more on the detail about this convener, but I mean, I think we've alluded to this a little bit in response to some earlier questions, but basically, you know, in straight response to your query, the Commission, Audit Scotland have welcomed the development of the Invest to Save Fund. I mean, it's of a relatively small quantum, and we would like to see that, I think, collectively grow over the years, and there is a payback mechanism within the current fund as well, which I know local authorities have raised concerns about. But I think both the Commission and, from my understanding, local authorities have collectively welcomed the design and development of the fund. And really, I think it's potentially come about as part of the Verity House Agreement discussions. And it sounds like we're getting stuck on multi-year funding, but it needs to be part of a wider fiscal framework, which is maybe not a subject for this morning, but I know this committee's discussed it in detail before, and the fiscal framework hasn't been delivered yet as part of the Verity House Agreement. A bit like multi-year funding, it's anticipated to potentially come this year. If that was to happen, then that might help with the development of the fund that you've referenced, make it larger, maybe look at the payback rules. But I can see that Derek wants to come in and expand on some of that.
I think one of the challenges to councils is they are very busy firefighting just to keep the show on the road, to actually release the resource. And it's not necessarily just a financial resource, it's staff time and expertise to drive forward a transformation agenda. I think one of the barriers we do see, maybe particularly in the smaller council, as a point Andrew alluded to earlier, that it's very difficult to free up the resource within the council to take forward some of that change process, because you have to keep delivering services while you're trying to do that. So I think the opportunity to create some kind of fund which would perhaps allow for additional resources to be brought in to help councils deliver change is something that would be welcome. And I think in our submission we did highlight one council, the Scottish Borders, who were working on a sort of Invest to Save principles before the Scottish Government's Fund was announced, and recycling the savings that were coming from that to plough into more innovative projects. So I think we do see, but one of the challenges which hopefully the fund will help is to create a resource that will enable councils to drive forward change.
Okay. Great. Thanks very much for that. I'm going to now, we're going to move on to a theme around budget challenges, and I'm going to bring in Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. There's no doubt over the last decade that every council has been managing efficiencies and savings, and some have done it in different ways to ensure that services continue. So that already is part of their DNA, and that's part of their process. But we hear that in the future, you know, these savings are not going to be enough. I mean, the cumulative budget that each council's facing has been talked about to be possibly £1 billion worth of savings by 27-28. So how can they prepare to bridge that gap when they already have taken many of the savings that would be expected without diminishing and losing some of that service level agreement that they have to provide for the communities they represent?
It's a really, really difficult challenge that local authorities face, and I think everyone, all 12 of us on the Commission, recognise that. You know, many of us have got direct local government experience, and we understand how challenging it is. And Audit Scotland officers are, and the Auditor General are also acutely aware of the very, as you've just outlined in your question, the very significant challenge that all 32 face, whether they're big or small. You know, capacity sometimes helps, but it doesn't always resolve problems, and sometimes there's advantages in being small, despite what I said earlier on. So it's a really, really difficult challenge. And I think I would just reference back to my very opening statement that where I quoted the covering note that Joe Armstrong, the Commission's chair, put in as the submission, which I know you've got to the committee when you asked us for evidence, where she clearly indicated that local authorities have been good at this over the last 10 to 15 years. They've actually balanced their budgets, they've made savings, they've transformed services, maybe with a small t, but they have had to change and alter services. No local authority, unlike, as I was just discussing with Willie earlier on, no local authority, unlike some in England, has fallen over financially, has had to have external governmental assistance or management input. So to date, I think it's really crucial to stress that the Commission feels that local authorities have managed this, but the point that Joe and the Commission has made in the covering note and in their evidence, and is what's behind your question, is that's going to become incrementally more and more difficult now as budgets remain broadly static. I know they've risen slightly in the last couple of years, but broadly static against increasing demands. And all the other issues which we haven't dwelt on this morning in terms of age profile, which there's more young people and more older people, less people in the middle of working age, and who delivers services for really young people and older people? It's councils, education, social care, and that demand therefore is going up. Income's static. And I guess that's why, going back to the transformation report that we debated earlier on, that Blythe and others have referenced as well, making those transformative changes is going to be ever more important. And we've got examples in the evidence we've submitted, and we will have more from the 32 local authorities once we've got them all next year. We've got the 10 that Blythe mentioned earlier on. But there is... I don't have, the Commission doesn't have a magic solution to this. I'd be lying to say otherwise. If there was a magic solution, local authorities would have done it already. There isn't a magic solution to this, and one size will not fit all. So the success, Derek just referenced the Borders. They've had a very successful spend to save sort of fund that's self-replenishing. There's other really positive best value reports that we've received recently. I think we referenced Dundee in our submission, that have done a lot of innovative and transformative work. But what they've done won't necessarily apply to other local authorities, i.e. Edinburgh, Glasgow, Clackmannanshire, or anybody else you wish to mention. So there isn't a one-size-fits-all. There isn't an easy solution to this, but there has to be a way through this for local authorities, because unless I'm missing something, unless you can tell me something I'm not aware of, budgets are not about to magically increase, and demand is not about to magically decrease. So the problem ain't going away, it's only going to become more acute. And that's why we're really pressing, along with the Improvement Service, along with Solace, who are doing very proactive work on all of this, to encourage local authorities to look at the transformation report and to embed those 5 principles in all that they do. I don't know if any colleagues want to expand on any of that. Derek?
No, as Andrew says, there's no magic wand as such. But just to give you the assurance that we are monitoring closely, and the Commission now every 6 months or so is receiving a set of what we see as key statistics. And one of the areas we're looking at is not the absolute cash value of savings, but the percentage. So looking at councils and what percentage of savings in their medium term are they having to make as a way of monitoring the sort of financial sustainability and identifying whether any councils have got a larger challenge than others. So things like ensuring that councils have medium-term financial strategies that are looking at least 3 to 5 years ahead in terms of their projections, in dialogue with the sector to look at the assumptions they're making behind that. make sure they've got capital investment strategies that align with our medium-term financial strategy. So there's a lot of safeguards as such that can be built in, and that certainly is one of the areas we see as one of our key roles in this process, to actually monitor what's happening in the sector and make sure that there's nobody falling off the edge of a cliff.
And, you know, in your own report, you talk about that you expect to see papers and you expect to see financial monitoring provided to elected members. Now, for me, who had the opportunity to be 18 years a councillor, that was very much the case. My own council had strong financial management. That was seen. It had short-term, medium-term and long-term plans. But it's quite evident that maybe that's not happening with everybody, because they're not aware of what the implications are within some of the councils and the overall financial position that the council could be in. So what evidence is there that that's not happening, that there are not some councils showing that strong financial management and having that clarity and giving elected members the opportunity to see what the problems could be and how they can be resolved?
Yeah, thanks, Alexander. It's another important point. Linking it back to, I think, Willie's earlier point about internal, external audit. I guess that really underscores the importance of internal audit, in particular, making sure that inside local authorities, without dependence on external audit backing things up, but even inside local authorities, they should be ensuring that elected members are aware of the global picture for their local authority area. And like yourself, I was 18 years a local councillor as well, and I'm relieved to say that in the main, I also had access all the time to good citywide, it was here in Edinburgh, fiscal information and budgetary frameworks and so on. But you're right, and Derek sort of alluded to this in his last point. Medium-term financial plans probably, I think I'm right in saying, don't exist for all 32 local authorities. I think the majority, but not all of them. So if you were to glance, if you so desire, a random set of findings from the Commission's best value reports, you will undoubtedly see that request for medium-term financial planning or longer-term financial planning being quite often repeated. What I think is probably reassuring is that often when we make that request in a finding, it is followed up. It links back to an earlier point. I can't remember who asked it, but local authorities, whilst they might not sort of shout hooray, Council Commission's coming in to audit us or Audit Scotland are, they do respond constructively. 99.9% of the time they respond constructively to our findings and embed what we recommend into forward programmes. So if there's a glaring omission of a medium-term financial strategy and we highlight that, it is often delivered.
Yeah, and as you've identified, Andrew, that there is the necessity to have the overview. You're there in a capacity to be guiding and to be giving that scrutiny at the end of the day. And some councils have kept reserves and tried to manoeuvre and play around with some of their finances to try and keep them in a stable position. But that is not the case for all, because not all of them have the same opportunity to do that. But it is interesting that you identify that elected members are not always given all the information, because that should be the case. That if they are part of that local authority, they have collective responsibility to manage their finances. Because as you've also identified, if that doesn't happen, then some may fall over the... And we don't want to go down that road of having to mean that they get special measures or taken over in any shape, way or form. Because at the end of the day, the professionals and the officers within an organisation of a council are there to advise and give clarity. The elected representatives make the decision, but it's on the guidance and the scrutiny that they've been provided with to ensure that they have that stability. And I hope that is still the case. Having been out for a decade, I hope that is still the case. But saying that in your report, you give a flag that could be seen as an issue.
In essence, I completely 100% agree with the point you're making. I'll maybe bring Derek in who wants to expand a bit more in response.
Yeah, I think I would start off saying that we're not aware of any major areas of concern. But the dialogue with others, one of the questions that we ask as part of the best value process is to look at the the way in which officers and members work together. So we have posed that question. I can recall in several discussions of particular councils, we've asked the question, how's the relationship between elected members and officers? And auditors will feed back their observations on attending and observing committee meetings. What's the degree of challenge? What's the quality of information, etc. So on the whole, it seems to be fairly positive. And I think the vast majority of audit reports I've seen have the phrase sound financial management as part of that. I think it's one of the areas I alluded to earlier, just a bit of concern where councils have reversed budget savings proposals. That's an area where it maybe suggests that the dialogue hasn't perhaps been as good as it could have been. And sometimes that's as much between elected members and the communities as much as officers. But I think there is an obligation in auditors. And as an accountant, I'd probably make an observation that accountants are very good or very bad at writing what turn out to be fairly technical reports. And I always think it's almost like written by accountants for accountants, and they do have to remember the audience to make sure that people are fully aware that it's put in plain English. I think there are areas of where improvements can be made.
And, you know, my last question is maybe touching on this sort of the human rights budgeting that's been talked about. Now, you say that Council provide limited information on how budget reductions and impacts particularly groups and communities. So is the Commission aware of that human rights budgeting being used by councils to make spending decisions? Is that part of that process now coming through?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we allude to in the evidence that you've just sort of quoted, Alexander, I mean, we are aware that is being used on occasion, but I think the point we're making is it needs to be more universally applied.
There's not enough of them doing it?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. Convener, that's from there.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to, before I bring in Fulton McGregor, who's online with a few questions, I wanted to pick up on something that was talked about last week, and it's a thread that's kind of started to come through the pre-budget scrutiny, which is that given that there's a limited envelope and different pressures, so the pressures that have been highlighted to us are early years provision, free school meals and adult social care. Those are the kind of looming pressures that most local authorities are facing. And there's been a bit of a call for we need a national conversation with people about what they need to be expecting in terms of what they get from their traditional public services, given there's this maybe a shift in direction that local authorities need to make these provisions. These are important. And then that means that local authorities councils need to look at reducing services, libraries, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to bring that in that kind of in the scope of this budget challenges piece, because I think that's the conversation we're having, isn't it? Is that there's these three critical areas, and maybe most people don't really understand that that's the big shift that's happening. When people are going about their daily lives, they don't understand that these things are what we need to now be addressing kind of quite critically and rapidly, and that's to address the ageing population, but also I think the government in general, there's a commitment through the Verity House Agreement around tackling childhood poverty. So I don't know if I've got a question in there. I just want to kind of bring that in and maybe how's that come into your thinking? Yeah.
No, I mean, I think it makes perfect sense, Convener, and I think it does link directly to the sort of demographic pressures that I generally sort of referenced a few moments ago around, the population profile is growing at both ends of the age spectrum, which is putting pressure on local authorities, and that links directly to the three areas you just referenced. Free school meals, early education and social care are primarily aimed at those two ends of the demographic profile, and that's what's increasing in Scotland, with the bit in the middle. Probably most of us who are sitting around the room today fall into. And there is no doubt that there's a gearing effect, for want of a better phrase, sort of gearing effect that the demand to deliver on those three areas, or early years and later years, just both ends of the demographic profile, puts a disproportionate pressure thereafter on the other areas that local authorities are responsible for delivering. Now, there are some areas of service delivery that local authorities provide that are non-statutory, that they could come out of, but there are some that are statutory that they can't come out of, that are not in those two ends of the demographic profile. And there's just no doubt that we see in the evidence that comes before us as the Commission, Audit Scotland, the Auditor General as well, I'm sure, that services like libraries, leisure services, swimming pools, delivery of environmental services, planning controls, etc., across local authorities get a disproportionate gearing impact upon them because of the protection around education and social care. But I think Derek might want to expand on that a bit.
I wonder if I could separate free school meals from the other two areas, which are very much the demographic changes. Free school meals is a good example where there's a lot of additional money being put in towards local government to deliver those services. I think one of the challenges that's created is the level of funding for it. And I think probably local government would say at the start it was fully funded because it was costing a lot of discussion. But when it's gone into the main grant settlement, it's not, the funding has not kept pace with the spiralling costs, particularly on wages and and other price inflation. So I think that's certainly something that's coming back from the dialogue we have with councils, is where there's an extra pressure because a policy initiative has been introduced, and over the passage of time, as each passing year, the level of there's been no additionality to help maintain the level of service. So that I would say is one area particularly, and I think there are other policy areas as well that account, and sort of teacher numbers is another one that comes up relatively frequently with the dialogue we'll have with council. So I think, as Andrew said, the more of which is directed towards policies and the core funding is not keeping pace with that demand, it is putting additional pressure on other areas where they might still be covered by statute, but the statute is not as specific as what you have to deliver, and that's things like libraries, leisure, etc., areas where they're probably seeing a disproportionate level of challenge for ongoing funding.
That's helpful. It's good to pull those three threads into the conversation. And Derek, I really appreciate you separating out the free school meals and pointing out that, yes, there's been funding applied, but it's not kept pace, and that's really helpful. I'm going to bring in Fulton McGregor, who's got a number of questions still on budget challenges, and he's joining us online. Fulton.
Yeah, thanks, Convener, and good morning to the panel. But probably just actually moving on nicely from your last question there, Convener. We're obviously seeing that councils are generating more income from fees and charges that they set out for certain services. And I'm wondering, do you feel that councils assess the impact of increased charges on individuals and communities, or do you feel it's more just a case of they're put in and that's it? I mean, there's an example just now in my own local authority for a charge for the brown bin, as it's called locally. So that's caused a wee bit of an uproar, if you like. Megan Gallagher will be aware of that as well. And so will Mark Griffin. So that's just one example. Obviously, there's other examples where leisure services are maybe being charged for more in order to cover costs there. How do you feel that all this fits in with preventive policy making? And as I said, how do you think councils are assessing these impacts on people?
Thanks very much, Fulton, for the question. I can't help but comment that as a resident of Edinburgh, sitting here in Edinburgh, I'm already having to pay for my brown bin to be uplifted, I'm afraid. But I completely get the point you're making at both a personal and a sort of a collective level, therefore. And I think it links to earlier discussions and points about use of human rights, consulting with local communities. I mean, where consultation with local communities around these issues, and I'm not going to sit here and claim for a second that Edinburgh got their consultation about the introduction of brown bin collection fees 100% correct, but it was implemented relatively painlessly, I sensed. It was long after I'd left the local authority, I'm pleased to say. And it's increased over the years, but not significantly, and there's no doubt that local authorities, as what was behind your question, I think, are now increasing charges in all sorts of areas, not just that area, but in other areas, to accommodate and resolve budget challenges. And I'm just going to reinforce the points that I made in response to a couple of earlier questions about it just really underscores the need for local authorities to consult fully and properly and meaningfully with communities before the introduction of these charges, because that again links to a point that Derek made about sometimes local authorities have reversed away from budget savings, whether it's the closure of a service or the change in a service, and that often behind that is a lack of proper communication and consultation with local communities at an earlier stage, and that just causes all sorts of problems in terms of getting a balanced budget. But I guess we see a mixed picture across the evidence that we get as a commission. Some authorities are good at this, some are not as good, and you see it coming through in the challenges that arise because of particular budget decisions, as colleagues have already alluded to. I don't know if anybody else wants to come in on that. Blythe and Derek?
I think that the first point I would make is if councils are putting forward increases in fees and charges as part of budget proposal, like any budget proposal, they should do an equality impact assessment on each individual one. So in a sense of reassuring Mr McGregor in terms of the question, the council should have done an equality impact assessment. The work that we've done suggests that councils are doing, although perhaps to varying degrees. But I think that's an important point to make, that they should be doing these impact assessments as part of that. I don't want to labour on sort of brown bins in particular, but if I could perhaps really, from my time working in a council, I remember a service putting forward a proposal to do away with the brown bin service, and because it was a non-statutory service, and elected members weren't happy about that, and they took the view that we'd rather introduce charges than see the service disappear. So perhaps that's I'm not sure that's helpful or not, but I think it's probably relevant in the context that these are sort of discussions that councils are making. It's quite interesting to see one council introducing charging now for a particular service when other councils have been charging for the same service for years. And I think that's part of what we'd encourage councils to do, is to look at what other councils are doing. I think and hope that they do that across a whole range of areas in terms of what their strategies are towards fees and charges, because there's a lot of data out there in terms of what levels of charges are and what councils are charging for and what they're not. But I think increasingly we are seeing an increased reliance on charges to help as an alternative perhaps to some budget cuts.
If I can just build on that point. So, yeah, Mr McGregor, the budget briefing that we published back in May, as part of that, we assessed the level to which councils carried out equality impact assessments as part of setting that budget, and all but one councils did complete that. However, councils are pretty good at that. They're pretty good at consulting. What is, I guess, less consistent is the sort of trace of that through to how that's influenced the decision. So we had some examples of where that was quite clear, but I think there's improvements that could be made in terms of how that has then influenced, as you say, the increase to particular fees and charges, for example. So that's something that we'll continue to look at as part of our budget analysis on an annual basis.
Yeah, thanks very much for those answers. I would just like to come back in on one part about the councils looking at what each other are doing. I think that is a great idea and should be happening. And I know that North Lanarkshire Council does look at other councils as other councils look at them. But one thing that I would want to make a point on that is it can't just be about mimicking and bringing in a service because a service might have been brought in North Lanarkshire or another council, and all the assessments and engagement might have been done in that council area. And if it's just replicated without that same engagement elsewhere, that's where probably issues can start. But anyway, that's just a wee point. My second question is around the reduction in the use of ring fencing, which we've seen over the past 3 years, but councils are still telling us that there's too many restrictions in place and how they can use their allocations. Andrew, what more do you think needs to happen to allow councils to have more autonomy in how they spend their money? Is there any other ideas you've got there?
Okay, no, thanks, Fulton. I mean, just on your latter point before I come to the question. I basically, I think, agree with what you're saying in terms of, and I did reference this earlier, one size doesn't fit all. I completely agree. You can't just take what one authority's done and do it in another authority. I mean, Derek's 100% correct. They should be looking at everything, and I think it's reassuring to hear you say that North Lanarkshire are potentially doing that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that things are completely sort of supplantable in other areas. But looking at what other authorities do is very, very good practice. But it doesn't mean that one size fits all. Just on your point about what else could be done in terms of releasing the sort of pressure on local authorities, and I think that undoubtedly I'm going to link back to the full development of the Very House Agreement, which has been progressed to an extent, but the fiscal framework isn't yet published publicly, I don't believe. We certainly haven't got sight of it as a commission or as Audit Scotland. I understand it's pretty fully developed, but it's not been finalised and signed off yet by the government and COSLA. And delivering on that, I think, would make a huge difference. It links back to the multi-year funding, 3-year funding sort of framework potentially. And whilst there has been, and again, I think I touched on this earlier, very welcome development in the reduction of ring fencing, that could still go further, but it's been sort of slightly counterbalanced by the demands that are on local authorities to deliver national policies. So money might not be ring-fenced, but there's a policy demand around early years that we've already discussed, around social care that we've touched on, that they can't avoid delivering upon. So it's a sort of de facto form of ring-fencing pressure that is still there on local authorities. And I think the delivery of a full fiscal framework as part of the Very House Agreement, which is hopefully coming, should help resolve and alleviate many of these issues. But I don't know if colleagues want to add anything to that. I hope that helps, Fulton.
Yeah, it does. It does. And just one final question, Convener, if I may then. We heard in last week's session that the allocation mechanism used to distribute Scottish Government funding is not working as well for some some smaller local authorities. Can you outline perhaps how a new fiscal framework can help overcome some of these issues when the councils are as small as some of them are last week?
Yeah,
some of them who presented last week are.
Yeah, well, you might not be surprised to hear, Fulton, I am going to completely duck this question and say that really the detail of that, seriously, it really is an issue for the Scottish Government and COSLA to resolve when they publish, hopefully, the fiscal framework. The Commission doesn't have a view on the sort of detail of that. I've outlined the principles we think that it should sort of deliver upon, and those principles are in the original Very House Agreement document that was signed several years ago now by COSLA and the Scottish Government, and it really is up to those two bodies to thrash out that detail. Looking around the room, I know there's lots of you will fully understand that it's an unbelievably sensitive issue, the allocation of monies across all 32 authorities. It's not something the Commission would opine on the detail of, but we really encourage the Government and COSLA to finalise the fiscal framework as quickly as possible.
Thanks. Yeah, just on that, I thought it was useful that what came up in last week's session was that the fiscal framework needs to include the funding formula, and that's the difficult bit there. And we heard from the smaller local authorities that they're certainly within the formula. It's not really working in terms of giving them what the pressures they're now seeing are not being covered by that formula. Yeah. So there's changing things have changed in their demographics. We're going to move on to the theme of workforce challenges, and you'll be glad to know this is our last few questions, and I'm going to bring in Mark Griffin initially and then Megan Gallagher. Mark Griffin.
I've got a couple of questions on workforce challenges. The first of those is around sickness absence, and we heard last week about problems related to sickness absence and also in recruitment and retention. And I just wonder if the Commission have an idea of the global costs to councils of that record level of sickness absences, if you have an idea of why they are so high at this particular point in time, and whether also you have an idea of how much councils are spending on temporary and agency staff to cover these record absence levels.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. I mean, I don't have the figures at my fingertips, but I might bring Martin in a second, who might be able to expand a little bit more in terms of some of the scale and quantity of this. But just to acknowledge what's behind your question, that yes, we see it as increasingly as an issue, and you've obviously picked this up from last week's evidence. You can see it across all of our best value reports or performance audits that sickness absence levels have increased very, very significantly. I think we referenced it in our own submission to the committee as well. And retention and recruitment of staff is a particular challenge we are seeing as the Commission in rural areas, Highlands and Islands, Western Isles, Orkney and Shetland, but also in small local authorities. Literally, the Clackmannanshire style of the smaller ones are finding it difficult to recruit officers with professional qualifications for specific posts, and there's no doubt that that is having a direct impact on those local authorities, whether it's Clackmannanshire, whether it's Highlands and Islands or Western Isles or Shetland or Orkney, having a direct impact on their ability to deliver the services and to transform along the lines that we've been debating and discussing this morning. But I don't know if Martin wants to come in to maybe expand on that a bit.
Yes, in terms of cost, I can't give you that figure. The total cost to the sector will very much be influenced by who is off and for how long, and the grading and terms and conditions, and when statutory sick pay comes into play. So you can't oversimplify it by saying because this has gone up. Because what you may see is an increase in costs due to the length of absence, and as has been already referenced, the demographics and the ageing workforce means that you may have seen an increase in cost due to the seniority of staff and age of staff, and also where they are within internal pay banding. Similarly, costs will have gone up due to annual pay increases, annual pay increments. So that's a long way of saying I can't give you a number. What we have seen, and the report that we produced was very much a summary of the 32 reports produced by auditors on the Commission's behalf. What we have seen is there could be an improvement in the level of data held and collected in terms of those costs, in terms of use of agency staffing and reliance upon those. But as Andrew said, in terms of the challenges and the recruitment challenges faced within particular rural and smaller authorities, there is that general acceptance that in terms of reliance on agency staffing, it's prevalent within the adult social care sector. We're all well versed in the implications of that. But yeah, just to add a degree of caution as to looking for a figure, because it will be influenced by the individuals.
And do you get a sense from your work with the 32 local authorities as to why the sickness absence levels are so high? You know, any recurring themes? You know, is it shrinking workforce, putting pressure on staff and leading to absence? Is it pay restraint in local government that's causing problem, or is it really an individualised issue when it comes to the 32?
I mean, I think, to be honest, Mark, it's probably the latter point you just mentioned. It's very, very individualised. I mean, I think I would be giving you sort of anecdotal evidence about what we see if I was to respond directly to those earlier points. I think it is more, and this is, I think, what Martin was alluding to as well. It's very, very individualised across the 32 authorities, and I touched on this a little bit, I guess, in my earlier response to your first point, that it is acute in some areas, retention and recruitment, and sickness absence is also better in some areas than it is in others. So I guess that's just a long way of saying I think it's your latter point. It's very, very individualised, and we don't have, I don't think, unless my colleagues contradict me, strong evidence to say that there's a specific nationwide trend here.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. My second question was on the Commission have stated that a key challenge in enabling transformative change relates to digital skills and capacity. You know, we heard that from councils last week too, and just to ask, what role does workforce planning have in addressing those challenges?
Right, no, thanks, Mark. I mean, it's a really important area, and workforce planning does have a big role to play. And just to sort of link back to some of the, I think several of us have mentioned some of the work that Solace, the Chief Executive's organisation, and the IS, the Improvement Service, are undertaking. They've got a digital stream. I think this was referenced when I mentioned earlier on that some of the Solace members were before the Commission in private session just last week. That there was a discussion around all of this, and there's a real understanding and awareness that, you know, it's probably not sustainable to have 32 different digital frameworks, for want of a better phrase, across all 32 authorities in a country which is as relatively small as Scotland. And there's a real acceptance now that that has to change, and a willingness to sort of make developments on that in the near future. And there's no doubt that workforce planning will have a big part to play in that. But I don't know if Martin or Blythe want to expand on any of that at all, or Derek?
Yeah, I think there's several issues within that that are related to topics that have already come up during this session. You could be glib and talk about the ageing demographics, but ultimately of not only Scotland but the council workforce themselves, but ultimately there is a requirement to ensure that staff are trained, keep pace with digital transformation. It's challenges that we all face, but it's particularly acute when you're asking for significant investment from the bodies they work for in things like digital solutions to mobile working. So in terms of the role of workforce planning, it's absolutely key within that, because not only do you have to ensure that the workforce is able to use those digital innovations and solutions that come into play, but ultimately it will have an impact on the requirement for staffing. So you have to ensure that your plans are well informed and reflective of that changing environment in order to establish what your future workforce requirement will be. And that then lends itself within the workforce planning framework to think about things like the demographic of the workforce, training that's required, apprenticeship programmes. So it's all very much interlinked, but it's a requirement for you to understand not only the now and the current operating environment, but where you can look at digital solutions, digital technology, digital efficiencies, and how that impacts your overall workforce from 5 to 10 years from now.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Commissioner.
I just want to pick up on that. I've got a couple of questions, and then I'll bring in Megan. So on the digital skills as connected, I'm going to join the retention part and the digital skills. And this might be out with your remit, but in terms of looking at workforce retention, is there any? Have you come across any evidence where the move to digitisation is maybe having people who are maybe older in the workforce thinking, I don't want to go down that route, I don't want to do that retraining? Because I'm aware anecdotally of that kind of happening, where people are like, well, that's a whole new skill set, I don't want to get into that, and then they choose to leave. Do you have you come across that at all?
I mean, I think, Kavina, we have, but again, I would agree with it. It's probably what we've got is anecdotal evidence to that effect. I wouldn't like to sit here and claim that we've got, you know, a statistical trend going on here. But anecdotally, yes, we've witnessed some of what you've just described occurring. And I guess it's not dissimilar to the point I was making about some of the small local authorities struggling to retain specifically qualified individuals. Now, some of those might be people with digital skills, but some of them might be, you know, senior finance officers. Some of the small authorities do struggle to employ and retain senior financial officers, and but not just small, rural and island as well. That's not to say that's not an issue in Glasgow or Edinburgh. It sometimes is, but it's a much bigger issue in small and rural communities and local authorities. But I think the evidence we've got is probably anecdotal on the specific point you've just raised.
Thanks. And just staying with this, you mentioned the island, particularly the island, and maybe more Highland. Or maybe let's just stick with islands. You mentioned that difficulty of actually recruiting people, and I wonder, again, it might be out with your remit, But housing, how much of a factor does that play? Because we've taken evidence on the challenges around housing in rural communities, island communities.
Yeah. No, it's a good point, and I'm struggling to remember which local authority it was, but we did come across one example in the last couple of years where a local authority, I can't remember if it was one of the islands, but it was one of the rural or island authorities that was really struggling to retain some specific staff. Actually, and housing was the issue, right. Is the point I'm making. But what they did to resolve it, and it did have some positive impact, was they included a housing offer into the recruitment campaign. And I don't know if anybody can remember which local authority that was. I think none of us can, I'm afraid. But
I wouldn't want to put on record in case I'm wrong.
But there was one, and maybe we can get back to you, Convener, and just confirm who that was. But it did come up, and I remember it distinctly. They used a housing offer because it was an issue for them as part of the recruitment campaign, and it had a very positive impact.
Well, that's good to hear. I'm now...
Just on that point, I think without wanting to stray into speculation, I think it is well understood that the lack of affordable housing and the higher cost of living within rural authorities do play a role in the recruitment challenges, and I believe that was cited within a report produced jointly by SOLAS, the Improvement Service, and the Society of Personnel Development Scotland that was published previously, which we drew upon within this work. But it is undoubtedly an issue, and I believe, and this is where I may have to correct the record, I believe one of the authorities has done it in the past is Murray Council around social care staff, certainly within the last decade or so, looked at housing and affordable housing not only as part of the investment plans, but in looking at, alongside the island authorities, who I believe have taken similar steps, about ensuring that key staff were, if you like, accelerated up and given access to that affordable housing opportunity, because otherwise you were looking at severe shortages within the area.
Okay, great. Thanks. Good to hear that there's a kind of proactive approach there. And I'm now going to bring in Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. The Accounts Commission recently reported on Glasgow City Council's early retirement and redundancy payouts, and I found this quite staggering, actually, to within the report to find out that the early retirement and redundancy payouts from restructuring proposals didn't receive any independent scrutiny, and the financial terms for the departures of 5 officials costed over £1 million. Now, given the payouts came at the same time as the council are, like many councils, grappling with ongoing budget cuts, this is embarrassing. It's embarrassing for the council, particularly councillors who are having to face up to these particular scenarios that can occur, but also indeed anger from communities who always see that the cuts are coming down, trickling down into the communities, but on the other hand seeing these big payouts for council officials. So how can we as a collective look at this better? How can councillors always be involved in these processes so that they have sight, whether it's in their audit or scrutiny committees or any other mechanisms that could be available to councillors to prevent these scenarios from happening?
Yeah, no, thanks, Megan. I mean, it's a really important point. You know, I'm sort of relieved in some ways to say it doesn't happen very often. But you might have noticed that I led on the media for this a couple of weeks ago, you know, I could reference it was a Section 102 report. So it was a specific report undertaken by the Controller of Audit on behalf of the Accounts Commission, and we had one a year or so ago with Aberdeen City Council as well. But they're very rare, these instances. But I hope you got the complete flavour of how frustrated we were as a commission by what happened in the tone of our findings and the media coverage that subsequently followed, because we were equally surprised by what had happened. The scheme of delegation wasn't adequate. Proper procedures weren't necessarily followed in this case, and you'll have read or heard that we were quite clear as a commission that the 9, as they are in Scotland, Nolan principles, particularly around integrity and objectivity, were not followed. Now, the incoming Chief Executive at City of Glasgow Council's rectified, with elected member input, rectified many of those issues now. The scheme of delegation has been changed, and there's been a training programme around the Nolan principles, I understand. And on the back of the findings that the Commission made around the Section 102 for Glasgow, as Deputy Chair, I wrote to all 32 local government chief executives and leaders, and we specifically highlighted the case of Glasgow to draw their attention to it. And we did the same. Joe Armstrong, as chair, did the same with Aberdeen, Section 102 that I mentioned a few moments ago, a year or so ago. And it is reassuring that these instances are rare, and it's also reassuring they're picked up, because both in Aberdeen, that was a whistleblowing instance that picked it up. In Glasgow, it was the annual audit that retrospectively picked it up. So they are getting picked up, but reassuringly that they're not that common. But I guess it really underscores, Megan, the need for all local authorities, which is exactly what's in my letter to them, to look at the scheme of delegation, to look at elected members' awareness and senior officers' awareness of the 9 Nolan principles, and to make sure that what we saw in Glasgow can't happen again.
That's helpful. And on whistleblowing, since you referenced it in your answer there, do you think that the whistleblowing procedures within councils are robust enough? Or again, is it something that councils should be mindful of, so people do feel the confidence that they can raise these matters through the correct processes?
Yeah, I mean, it's the latter point, really. I mean, I couldn't sit here and say that the whistleblowing policies in all 32 are 100% marvellous. We just don't have that evidence at our fingertips, but every local authority should make sure they're adequate, and that the point you just raised is the most important one. It's that the individual members of staff have confidence that they can use the system safely, and that is exactly what happened in Aberdeen's case a year or so ago, as I said, reassuringly. But it is up to local authorities to make sure that they've got appropriate whistleblowing policies in place, because clearly the Aberdeen example shows that it can have, it was a negative issue, but the whistleblowing had a very positive impact.
Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. And almost right on time. That concludes our questions. And many, many thanks for your contributions this morning. I think it's been a very helpful contribution to our work on the pre-budget scrutiny session. So thanks for coming and joining us this morning. And we previously agreed to take the next items in private, so I now close the public part of the meeting and we'll move into private.